Welcome back. Three state-owned Mozambican companies whose government guaranteed debts led the country's default have criticized an audit by Kroll LLC questioning their actions in the scandal. The companies queried two findings by Kroll, including that more than $500 million of debt remains unexplained, and say the entire maritime security project that loans funded was public from the very beginning. The companies reacted in a letter from their lawyers to the Attorney General. Mozambique's government last year admitted to the International Monetary Fund that it agreed to about $1.4 billion of loans it previously hadn't disclosed, prompting the Washington-based lender to hold financing to the country. Mozambique is in default after missing at least two payments on its $727 million worth of Eurobonds this year. Now, the World Annual Meetings of the Boards of Governors of the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund is underway in Washington, D.C. And we have Channel's business editor, Bosin Omofaye, who joins us now to tell us more about the proceedings at this year's event. Many thanks. It's good to see you, Bosin, from Washington. So can you give us a lowdown of this year's meetings?
Well, this year's meeting will focus on a few of the what you call the usual topics: the state of the world economy, of course, the World Economic Outlook report.
Well, we're having freezing images there, but of course, just before you joined us, we filed in a report telling us about some of the things to expect at this year's meetings of the World Bank and IMF.
Now, the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF all this week in Washington, D.C. will focus on a number of usual topics: the world economic outlook, global financial system stability, and, of course, the future of globalization. But there will be other discussions around natural disasters and weather conditions and their impact on markets and economies around the world, including immigration. For African delegates attending this meeting, they'll be looking out for discussions around inclusive growth, the role of women and youth, and how to leverage this human capital for development in sub-Saharan Africa. There'll be other topics of discussion, including the power of the private sector to leverage sustainable development and, of course, innovation and technology. On the final day of these meetings, the discussion will center around fighting corruption, a very important topic for a number of African economies.
Well, Bosin Omofaye is back with us to tell us more about the meetings of the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, D.C. So you were telling us about some of the highlights of this year's meetings, Bosin.
Yes, of course. Basically, as I said, the G24 meetings is starting right now as I speak, and in the next about 10 minutes, the launch of the World Economic Outlook. Of course, this report will set the tone for these annual meetings, as always done here in Washington, World Bank, IMF. Then, of course, the state of the global financial system and the future of globalization. However, beyond these usual topics about the state of the economy, a few issues have been noticed on the agenda. For example, the immigration crisis in Europe and what the Trump administration is doing regarding the border with Mexico and immigrants from a number of countries that have been penciled down by the administration, Muslim countries, including Chad in northern part of Nigeria. Now, if you look at the agenda as well, you find issues such as natural disasters and climate change. This is also becoming a very big issue, and this annual meetings is dedicating 1 or 2 sessions to discuss natural disasters. And you can see this season of hurricanes in the U.S. extending from June now till October. And I heard this morning this very deadly natural disasters may extend until November, and we have more of these incidences now than we had in 2016. Then you have the climate change, which is also an issue as well. When you look at all of this put together, of course, the Trump administration wants to get out of the COP24, the deal knocked together under the Obama's administration in 2016. So all this put together shows that, look, this meeting is just beyond the economics and talking to finance ministers and central banks, but how do the global economies factor in natural disasters, immigration, and climate change as part of policy issues, our policy design, the response and the impact that these natural disasters will have on economies and the financial markets moving forward. BC.
Now, also, why do you think that this year's annual meetings has a session dedicated to the topic fighting corruption on the last day of the summit?
Very interesting. About a week ago, the IMF actually issued a press statement and a report of a few pages saying that the International Monetary Fund is taking corruption very seriously. Of course, they've always taken it seriously, but they believe that corruption is a very key issue. It impacts on how countries deal with this very epidemic, not just in Nigeria, but around the world. If you want to know, the gentleman who is my camera crew here, who has the camera crew for China's television here, is a Spanish man, and he told me yesterday that the ruling party in Spain has about 400 corruption cases around that political ruling party as we speak. So we were having a discussion yesterday afternoon, and he said, look, corruption is not just about in Africa, but in developed economies as well. And he was using his country, Spain, and the Catalonia issue as one example of where corruption is also very rife within the ruling party. So fighting corruption, the panel on Sunday morning, 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in Washington, focuses a lot more on fighting corruption. And of course, Nigeria's two-time finance minister, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, will be a member of that panel that would focus. So wrapping up this one-week annual meetings on fighting corruption looks like an icing on the cake, because the entire conversation, whether you're using welfare or GDP, or you're including women, inequality, bringing youths into the human capital conversation, or using the power of the private sector for sustainable development, all this will amount to nothing if you don't have corruption handled, and very critically as well.
Now, one last question in less than 1 minute. Tell us, what will be the key issues for Africa's finance chiefs and governors at this meeting?
We'll just talk about it. Corruption is going to be number one. Everybody wants to know about it. Then there's also macroeconomy, the role of the central bank in solving sovereign debt. Of course, the debt is rising in a number of developing countries. A number of African countries are under the IMF program as we speak. Nigeria is out of it, or Ghana, 3 countries in West Africa, Togo, Benin Republic, Kenya, and a few others. So this will be key issues for Africa delegates here. They will look at corruption, they will look at sovereign debt, they'll look at how to integrate the financial markets more globally, and what will they be able to get from the World Bank and IMF moving forward in terms of the support they get, not just in terms of money, but technically speaking as well.
Many thanks, Bolson, for those updates coming from Washington, the IMF World Bank meetings going on in Washington in the United States. And that's our program today. Thank you for watching. I am BC at Dubai.